Sometimes the loneliest people are those who once loved the deepest. Sometimes the strongest hearts are the ones that have been broken the most. In Lancaster County, 67-year-old Josiah Miller lives alone on his farm. His wife Martha passed 3 years ago, and his children rarely visit anymore. He tends his fields and cares for his animals, but the joy has gone out of his life. He's become a man who simply goes through the motions of living. On a hot August evening, while doing his evening chores, Josiah suddenly collapses in his barn. His heart has stopped. No one knows he's lying there except for 10-year-old Lucy Thompson, the English girl next door who loves watching the Amish way of life. She finds him just in time. What this little girl does next changes both their lives forever. But why does her simple act of kindness break down walls that have stood for years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Josiah Miller's farm as he stepped onto his front porch, Martha's simple gold wedding band catching the early light. He still wore it after 3 years, unable to bring himself to remove the last physical connection to the woman who had been his companion for 42 years. The familiar weight of it on his finger was both comfort and torment. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he surveyed the 120 acres that had been in his family for 4 generations. The corn stood tall and green in the August heat. The dairy cows grazed peacefully in the pasture, and the red barn stood solid against the Pennsylvania sky. Everything looked as it should, yet nothing felt right anymore. Martha's rocking chair sat beside him, draped with the wedding ring quilt she had finished just months before her diagnosis. He couldn't bear to move it, couldn't bear to sit in it, and couldn't bear to look at it for too long. Some mornings, he found himself talking to the empty chair, sharing the small details of his day as he had for so many years. Then he would catch himself and feel foolish. A grown man speaking to memories. The sound of a diesel engine broke the morning silence as the milk truck rumbled down the lane. Josiah raised his hand in greeting to the driver, a gesture of politeness rather than warmth. He had withdrawn from the easy friendships that had once sustained him. The weekly visits from his bishop had dwindled to monthly, then occasional. His neighbors still nodded respectfully when they passed, but the comfortable conversations had faded along with his smile. Inside the farmhouse, the silence pressed against him like a physical weight. Martha's presence had filled every room with warmth and purpose. She had hummed while cooking, called out observations about the weather, shared her thoughts about their children and grandchildren. Now the house felt like a museum of their former life together, preserved but no longer living. He moved through his morning routine with methodical precision. Black coffee in the same cup Martha had given him 20 years ago. 2 pieces of toast, with butter, no jam. He had lost his taste for sweet things. The newspaper lay unread on the kitchen table. The outside world seemed increasingly irrelevant to his small circle of existence. His 3 children had tried, in their different ways, to draw him back into the family fold. Ruth, his eldest at 45, had taken on the role of concerned caretaker, calling twice weekly and visiting monthly with her husband and 4 children. She would bustle around the kitchen, cleaning things that were already clean, cooking meals that would sit largely uneaten after she left. "Dad, you're getting too thin," she would say, using the Pennsylvania Dutch word for father that connected them to their heritage. "You need to eat more. You need to take better care of yourself." But caring for himself felt like betraying Martha's memory. The weight he had lost, the clothes that hung loose on his frame, these were visible signs of his grief, and he wore them like a penance. Aaron, his middle child at 42, approached his father's isolation with frustrated practicality. A successful carpenter who had expanded beyond the traditional Amish clientele to serve the growing English population in Lancaster County, Aaron believed in solutions and action. "Come work with me, Dad," he had offered repeatedly. "We have more contracts than we can handle. The tourists love authentic Amish craftsmanship. You could teach my boys the old techniques." But Josiah had no interest in performing his heritage. For curious outsiders, the idea of creating furniture and cabinets for people who saw his way of life as quaint entertainment left him feeling hollow. Miriam, his youngest at 38, had tried a gentler approach. She would arrive with her 3 daughters and attempt to recreate the family gatherings that had once filled the house with laughter. But her efforts only highlighted what was missing. The girls would run through the rooms that had once echoed with their grandmother's delighted laughter, and Josiah would find himself retreating to his workshop to escape the painful contrast. Workshop behind the house had become his refuge. Here, surrounded by the tools his father had taught him to use, he could lose himself in the familiar rhythm of creating useful things. He made simple repairs for neighbors, crafted the occasional piece of furniture, but the passion that had once driven him to create beautiful, intricate works had died with Martha. She had been his first audience for every project, running her hands over smooth finishes, admiring joinery, suggesting small improvements that usually proved exactly right. Without her appreciation, his craftsmanship felt purposeless. 3 months ago, new neighbors had moved into the small farmhouse that bordered his property to the east. The house had stood empty for 2 years after old Heinrich Stoltz passed away. His children, unable to maintain the property from their homes in Ohio. The new owners were English outsiders to the Amish community, but not uncommon in Lancaster County, where the slower pace of life and scenic beauty attracted families seeking escape from suburban complications. Carol Thompson was a single mother in her mid-30s, a fact that had stirred quiet discussion among the Amish women in the district. She worked as a nurse at Lancaster General Hospital and had moved to the area for the schools and the chance to raise her daughter in a safer environment. Her daughter Lucy was 10 years old, a curious child with brown hair usually pulled back, in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Josiah had watched the Thompsons from a distance, noting Carol's careful attempts to maintain the small farm property, her daughter's fascination with the horses and buggies that passed their lane, the way the child would stand at the fence line watching his cows graze. The girl reminded him of his own daughters at that age, full of questions and wonder about the world around them. Several times over the summer, he had seen Lucy sitting on her front porch with books, often looking up to watch him work in his fields. Once, when a summer storm had damaged a section of the fence between their properties, Carol had approached him hesitantly to ask about repairs. "I can fix it myself," she had said, clearly trying not to impose. "I just wanted to make sure I used the right materials, did it the way you'd prefer." He had studied her for a long moment, noting the sincerity in her request, the respect she was trying to show for his preferences. "I'll see to it," he had said finally, and had spent the following morning replacing the damaged posts and rails with proper materials, refusing her offer of payment. That small interaction had been his longest conversation with an English person in months, and he found himself thinking about it occasionally. There had been no assumptions in Carol Thompson's manner, no condescension or curiosity about his way of life. She had simply treated him as a neighbor, nothing more or less. The summer had progressed with this distant but cordial awareness between the properties. Carol maintained her small garden and worked her shifts at the hospital. Lucy attended a summer reading program at the local library and spent her free time exploring their new surroundings with the intense curiosity of childhood. Josiah had noticed Lucy's particular interest in his animals and the seasonal rhythms of farm life. She would arrive at the fence line each morning around the time he did his chores, watching as he milked the cows, fed the chickens, and checked on the horses. She never called out or tried to engage him in conversation, seeming to understand instinctively that he preferred his privacy. But children have a way of seeing through the walls adults build around themselves. Where his own grandchildren had learned to approach him carefully, mindful of his grief and the changes it had brought. This English girl watched him with uncomplicated interest. She didn't carry the weight of knowing who he had been before, didn't measure his current self against memories of a more joyful grandfather. On this particular August evening, as Josiah moved through his routine of evening chores, he was unaware that his life was balanced on the edge of transformation. The heat had been oppressive all day, the kind of humid thickness that made every task an effort. He had spent the afternoon in his workshop, avoiding the worst of the sun, emerging only as shadows began to lengthen across the farmyard. The cows needed to be brought in from the far pasture, the chickens secured for the night, the horses checked and watered. These were tasks he could perform without conscious thought, their familiarity a comfort in a world that had lost most of its reliable pleasures. As he walked toward the barn, Martha's wedding ring caught the late sunlight once more. In a few hours, that simple band would become something different, not just a symbol of loss, but a connection to the possibility of love continuing in unexpected forms. But for now, it was simply what it had been for 3 years. A weight he carried, a reminder of what could never be replaced, and a barrier between himself and whatever came next. The evening air hung thick with August heat as Josiah made his way to the barn for evening chores. He paused at the door, wiping sweat from his forehead with Martha's embroidered handkerchief. The cows waited patiently at the gate, ready for their routine milking. He'd been feeling off all day, a tightness in his chest, moments of breathlessness he blamed on the oppressive humidity. At 67, such discomfort seemed part of growing older, especially when grief weighed so heavily on his spirit. Lucy Thompson sat on her front porch, studying the first aid manual from her school safety course. The 10-year-old had earned her CPR certificate that spring, though she never expected to use it. From her porch, she could see across the pasture to Mr. Miller's barn, where she often watched him work with quiet fascination. Tonight, something seemed different. Mr. Miller moved more slowly than usual, pausing several times as if catching his breath. The heat was brutal. Maybe it was affecting him more than normal. Inside the barn, Josiah began milking with practiced rhythm. The familiar motions usually calmed him, but tonight the pressure in his chest intensified. A strange tingling spread down his left arm as he straightened from the milking stool. The world suddenly tilted. The barn spun around him, walls becoming distant and strange. His left arm went numb, and crushing pain exploded across his chest, shooting up into his jaw. He reached desperately for support, finding only air. The metal milk pail clattered to the floor, white liquid spreading across the straw. He tried to call out, but no sound came. The massive heart attack struck with devastating speed, one moment standing, the next collapsing onto the barn floor as his heart struggled to maintain life. Lucy noticed Mr. Miller had entered the barn, but hadn't emerged when expected. The cows were making unusual sounds, restless and agitated. She set aside her manual and walked to the fence line. "Mr. Miller?" she called. No response, only the continued distress of the cattle. Her mother had taught her to trust her instincts. If you think someone needs help, it's better to be wrong and embarrassed than right and too late. Lucy climbed through the fence rails, her heart racing as she approached the barn. She found him motionless on the straw, his face gray and breathing shallow. The spilled milk darkened the straw around him. Even at 10 years old, Lucy recognized the signs: the pallor, cold sweat, labored breathing. Her training kicked in with startling clarity. She knelt beside him, calling his name and shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. His skin felt cold despite the heat. Pressing her ear to his chest, she heard his heart's irregular, struggling rhythm. Lucy ran for her house, shouting before she reached the door, "Mom, Mr. Miller collapsed. I think he's having a heart attack. Carol Thompson dropped everything and ran toward her daughter's voice, recognizing genuine crisis. Years of nursing had taught her to identify real emergencies, and Lucy's tone carried unmistakable urgency. "Show me." They ran across the pasture together. Carol assessed Josiah quickly while calling 911. "This is Carol Thompson, registered nurse. 67-year-old male in cardiac arrest at 412 Miller Lane. We need paramedics immediately." As Carol positioned herself for CPR, Lucy moved to help. "Let me do compressions, Mom. I know how." Carol looked at her daughter's determined face and nodded. Lucy had been trained and was calm under pressure. Just like school, count out loud. Lucy placed her small hands on Josiah's chest, fingers interlocked exactly as taught. She began compressions, counting steadily while Carol provided rescue breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her arms ached, but she couldn't stop. This quiet, sad man needed her to keep fighting for his life. With each compression, she was refusing to let him slip away. Sirens wailed in the distance, the most beautiful sound Lucy had ever heard. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their expertise taking over from desperate improvisation that had kept Josiah alive during critical moments. "You did really good work," one paramedic told Lucy. "Your quick thinking probably saved his life." Lucy watched them load Mr. Miller into the ambulance, his face covered with oxygen mask, body connected to beeping machines. She felt scared and proud simultaneously, aware of how quickly life could change and how much one person's actions could matter. Carol embraced her daughter as the ambulance disappeared down the lane. "You were incredibly brave tonight. Mr. Miller is alive because of you." Lucy thought about her first aid certificate, how she'd never believed she'd actually need those skills. She thought about Mr. Miller's quiet sadness, his solitary work. Most of all, she thought about how the most important moments arrive without warning, demanding we choose whether to run toward danger or away. Tonight, she had run toward danger and saved a life. Tonight, she had discovered that even a 10-year-old could be a hero when circumstances demanded it. Tonight, everything had changed for both her and the quiet Amish man, whose life now hung in the balance dot as they walked home. Lucy carried the knowledge that she had made a fundamental difference. But she also carried something else, the beginning of a connection to Josiah Miller that would transform both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The hospital bracelet around Josiah's wrist read, "Miller, Josiah, Dobb, March 15th, 1957. Allergies, not known." The simple plastic band felt foreign against his skin, a stark reminder of his vulnerability in a place that smelled of antiseptic and hummed with the constant activity of modern medicine. He stared at it as consciousness slowly returned, the events of the previous evening reassembling themselves in his memory, like pieces of a puzzle. The cardiac intensive care unit at Lancaster General Hospital was a world away from the quiet rhythms of his farm. Machines monitored every heartbeat, every breath, their electronic voices creating a symphony of beeps and whispers that never ceased. Through the large window of his room, he could see the controlled chaos of the nursing station, where people in scrubs moved with purposeful efficiency. Dr. Sarah Chun, a cardiologist in her 40s, pulled up a chair beside his bed. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and her manner was both professional and reassuringly calm. "Mr. Miller, you've suffered what we call a massive myocardial infarction, a major heart attack. The damage to your heart muscle was significant. But you're alive because someone got to you quickly and provided immediate CPR." Josiah's voice came out as a croak. "The child." "Yes, your neighbor's daughter. Lucy Thompson, I believe. She and her mother kept you alive until the paramedics arrived." "You're very fortunate, Mr. Miller. Without their intervention, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The weight of that statement settled over him slowly, a 10-year-old English girl had saved his life. A child he barely knew, who had no obligation to him whatsoever, had run toward danger instead of away from it. The thought was both humbling and profoundly unsettling. Dr. Chun continued her explanation of his condition, using terms like ejection fraction and cardiac catheterization, but Josiah's mind kept drifting to the image of Lucy kneeling beside him in the barn, her small hands pushing against his chest with determined rhythm. How had she known what to do? How had she found the courage? "Your children are here," Dr. Chun said gently. "They've been waiting all night. Would you like to see them?" Ruth entered the room first, her face puffy from crying, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from the sleepless night. She moved to his bedside and took his hand, her own trembling slightly. "Dad, you scared us so much." Behind her came Aaron and Miriam, their faces showing a mixture of relief and concern. Aaron's jaw was tight with the kind of controlled emotion that had characterized him since childhood, while Miriam's eyes were red-rimmed but determined. "How are you feeling?" Miriam asked, her voice soft with the tenderness she had always shown as the youngest child. "Weak," Josiah admitted, surprised by his own honesty. For 3 years, he had insisted he was fine when his children asked. Now, connected to machines and wearing a hospital bracelet, such pretense seemed pointless. Aaron moved to the foot of the bed, his carpenter's hands gripping the metal rail. "Dad, we need to talk about some changes. You can't keep living alone like this. What if this had happened and no one found you?" The familiar tightness began to form in Josiah's chest, not the physical pain of his heart condition, but the emotional constriction he felt whenever his children tried to manage his life. The Lord's will included putting that little girl in the right place at the right time, Ruth interrupted, her voice sharp with maternal authority. "Don't use faith as an excuse to be stubborn about accepting help." The conversation that followed was one they had danced around for 3 years. His children wanted him to move into a dowdy house attached to one of their homes, to accept the role of aging patriarch who could be properly cared for and supervised. They spoke of practical concerns, his health, his isolation, the difficulty of maintaining the farm alone. What they didn't understand, what he couldn't seem to explain, was that leaving the farm would feel like abandoning Martha. Every corner of that house held memories of their life together. The kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals, the bedroom where they had held each other through joy and sorrow, the porch where they had watched their children grow up. These weren't just spaces to him. They were sacred ground. "I need to think," he said finally, closing his eyes against the weight of their expectations. His children exchanged glances, loaded with 30 years of unspoken communication. They would give him time, that they wouldn't give up. The heart attack had changed the equation of his stubborn independence. After they left for lunch, promising to return with some of his clothes and necessities, Josiah lay in the mechanical silence of his room and tried to make sense of what had happened to him. The doctors spoke of lifestyle changes, of medication regimens, of the need for support and monitoring. But what occupied his thoughts was the question of why he had been saved. For 3 years, he had moved through his days like a man serving out a sentence, waiting for his time to join Martha. He had stopped planning for the future, stopped investing in relationships, stopped finding joy in the work that had once defined him. If God had been ready to call him home, why had he sent a child to intervene? A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Carol Thompson stood in the doorway, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from the previous evening shift, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had worked through the night and then stayed to worry about a neighbor. "I hope it's okay, Dad." "I came," she said hesitantly. "I wanted to check on you before I went home to sleep." "Please," Josiah managed, gesturing toward the chair Dr. Chin had vacated. Carol settled herself and studied. his face with the professional assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating patient conditions. "You look much better than you did 12 hours ago. How are you feeling?" "Grateful," he said, the word surprising him with its completeness. "Your daughter, what she did, I don't know how to thank you both. Lucy's at school today, but she wanted me to tell you she hopes you feel better soon. She's been worried about you." Carol paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "She's also been full of questions about your way of life. The Amish faith, the farming practices, the community aspects. I hope that's not inappropriate." Josiah found himself genuinely curious about what Lucy wanted to know. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his faith, his traditions, his beliefs? His own grandchildren had grown up with these things as simply the way life was, never requiring explanation. But to an outsider's child, his world might seem worth exploring. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "Oh, everything. Why you don't use electricity, how you make decisions as a community, what it's like to live so simply. She's particularly fascinated by your animals and the way you manage the farm without modern machinery." Carol smiled. "I think she's romanticizing it a bit, the way children do, but her interest seems genuine." The idea that his way of life might be worthy of someone's curiosity was oddly comforting. For so long, he had felt like a relic, a man whose skills and values were increasingly irrelevant in a world that moved faster every year. That a bright child might find something worth learning in his traditions touched something in him that had been dormant for too long. "When I'm well enough," he heard himself saying, "perhaps she could visit the farm. See how things actually work, not just the romantic version." Carol's face brightened with surprised pleasure. "She would love that, Mr. Miller. Really love it. But only when you're feeling stronger, of course." After she left, Josiah lay back against his pillows and considered what he had just offered. For 3 years, he had avoided having visitors, had discouraged even his own grandchildren from spending time at the farm. The house was too quiet, the memories too raw, his own company too poor to inflict on anyone else. But something about Lucy's intervention, her courage and competence in the face of crisis, had created a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. Perhaps it was simply gratitude, or perhaps it was something more, a recognition that life had handed him an unexpected second chance, and refusing to examine its possibilities would be its own kind of sin. The hospital bracelet caught the light from the window as he raised his arm to adjust his position. Such a simple thing, a piece of plastic with basic information, yet it represented his connection to the world of the living, his participation in the ongoing human story, rather than his withdrawal from it. For the first time in 3 years, Josiah Miller found himself wondering what came next, rather than simply enduring what was. 2 weeks later, Josiah sat on his front porch, Martha's recipe box resting on the small table beside him. The wooden box, with its hand-carved details and brass hinges, had been a wedding gift from his father-in-law 45 years ago. Inside, hundreds of index cards bore Martha's careful handwriting recipes for apple butter, instructions for preserving peaches, the formula for her famous shoe-fly pie that had won ribbons at the county fair. He had carried the box out from the kitchen that morning, drawn by an impulse he couldn't fully explain. Since returning from the hospital, he found himself touching objects that had been Martha's, not with the desperate clinging of early grief, but with something gentler, a desire to remember rather than to forget that Dr. Chun had prescribed a careful regimen of rest, medication, and gradual return to activity. His children had arranged a schedule of visits and check-ins that left him little time alone, a kindness that felt somewhat like loving surveillance. Ruth arrived each morning with breakfast already prepared. Aaron stopped by after work to help with evening chores, and Miriam came on weekends with her daughters to clean and cook for the week ahead. Their attention was welcome, but overwhelming. For 3 years, he had lived in perfect solitude. Now he found himself accountable for every meal, every activity, every symptom or sign of fatigue. He understood their concern, appreciated their love, but felt smothered by their good intentions. Sound of voices from the Thompson property caught his attention. Lucy was home from school. Her backpack dropped carelessly by the front gate as she ran to greet her mother, who was arriving from her shift at the hospital. Their reunion was brief, but warm, a quick hug, an exchange of news about their respective days, the easy intimacy of a small family unit. Josiah watched their interaction with the careful observation he had, once reserved for studying the weather or assessing his crops. There was an efficiency to their affection, a way of connecting quickly and meaningfully before moving on to the practical needs of the evening. Carol would need to start dinner. Lucy would have homework. Both would need to transition from the public worlds of work and school to the private space of home. Lucy looked up from her conversation with her mother and waved when she noticed him on his porch. The gesture was simple, friendly, without the careful concern that characterized his interactions with his own family members since the heart attack. "How are you feeling, Mr. Miller?" she called across the distance between their properties. "Better, thank you," he called back and realized he meant it. That evening, as Aaron helped him with the evening milking, his son brought up a subject that had been weighing on all their minds. "Dad, I've been talking with Ruth and Miriam. We think you should consider getting a phone installed, at least a basic line for emergencies. If that little girl hadn't found you when she did." "That little girl has a name," Josiah interrupted, surprising himself with the sharpness in his voice. "Her name is Lucy Thompson, and she saved my life." Aaron paused in his work, studying his father's face. "You're right. I'm sorry." "Lucy Thompson. But my point stands, you need a way to call for help if something happens again." The conversation about modern conveniences was an old one in their family. Josiah's adherence to traditional Amish practices had become more rigid after Martha's death, as if maintaining their old ways could somehow maintain his connection to her. But the heart attack had introduced a new element, the recognition that his choices affected more than just himself. "I'll consider it," he said finally, a concession that surprised Aaron into silence. Over the following days, a new routine began to emerge. Lucy would arrive home from school and, after completing her homework under her mother's supervision, would often walk to the fence line between their properties. She never presumed to cross onto his land without invitation, but she would stand there and observe his work with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in learning. Josiah found himself timing his afternoon chores to coincide with her arrival. He would move his work closer to the fence line, ostensibly to repair sections that needed attention, but really to be available for the conversations that had begun to develop between them. "Why don't your cows have names?" Lucy asked one afternoon, watching him guide the small herd back toward the barn. "They have names," Josiah replied, opening the gate for Bessie to pass through. "Bessie here is the lead cow. The brown one behind her is Daisy. The young one trying to push ahead is Molly." "Oh." Lucy seemed pleased by this information. "My mom says you don't use electricity. How do you keep the milk cold?" The questions came naturally, without the self-consciousness that often characterized adult inquiries about Amish practices. Lucy wasn't asking because she thought his ways were quaint or primitive. She was asking because she wanted to understand how things worked. Josiah found himself explaining the spring house where milk and other perishables stayed cool, the seasonal rhythms that guided food preservation, the community cooperation that made such practices sustainable. As he talked, he realized how long it had been since anyone had asked him to share his knowledge rather than simply accept their help. Carol Thompson had been watching these interactions from her kitchen window with growing interest. Her daughters' fascination with their Amish neighbor had initially seemed like a passing phase, The way children sometimes become intensely interested in subjects that capture their imagination. But Lucy's interest appeared to be deepening rather than fading, and Mr. Miller seemed to be responding with increasing warmth. One evening, as Lucy helped her set the table for dinner, Carol decided to test the waters of a developing friendship. "Lucy, would you like to invite Mr. Miller for dinner tomorrow night? I'm making pot roast, and he might enjoy a home-cooked meal." Lucy's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Really? Can I ask him now?" "After dinner, yes. But remember, he might say no, and that's okay too. He's still recovering and might not be ready for company." But when Lucy approached the fence line that evening with her invitation, Josiah surprised them both by accepting immediately. He hadn't eaten a meal prepared by someone outside his family in years, hadn't sat at another person's table since before Martha's illness. The prospect was both appealing and terrifying. The next evening, Josiah walked across the pasture, separating their homes carrying Martha's recipe box. He wasn't sure what had prompted him to bring it, only that leaving it behind felt wrong for such an occasion. Carol Thompson had set her small dining room table with care, nothing fancy, but clean and welcoming. Lucy had picked wildflowers for a centerpiece and had spent the afternoon helping with food preparation, her excitement palpable. "Thank you for accepting our invitation," Carol said as she served the pot roast. "I hope you don't mind simple fare." "It smells wonderful," Josiah replied, and meant it. The kitchen held the warm aromas of home cooking that had been absent from his own house for too long. His own meals had become exercises in sustenance rather than pleasure, quick and functional affairs that filled his stomach without nourishing his spirit. Lucy had positioned herself directly across from him at the table, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Mr. Miller, what's in the box?" Josiah looked down at Martha's recipe box, which he had placed beside his chair. "These were my wife's recipes. She was a wonderful cook." He paused, then lifted the box onto the table. "Perhaps your mother would like to see them." Carol accepted the invitation with obvious pleasure, her nursing hands gentle as she lifted the wooden lid. The cards inside were organized by category: breads, preserves, desserts, main dishes, each section marked with Martha's careful tabs. "These are beautiful," Carol said, examining a card for apple butter. "Look at this handwriting. And the detail in the instructions. She must have been very thorough." "She was," Josiah agreed. "She could cook for 3 people or 30, depending on what the occasion required. Church dinners, barn raisings, harvest celebrations. She never seemed flustered by the numbers." Lucy leaned forward to look at the cards her mother was examining. "What's a barn raising?" For the next hour, as they shared Carol's excellent pot, roast and fresh vegetables from her garden, Josiah found himself explaining Amish community traditions to an audience that listened with genuine interest. Lucy's questions were direct and practical. How many people came to a barn raising? How long did it take? Who decided what kind of barn to build? Carol's questions were more subtle, focused on the social dynamics that made such cooperation possible. How did the community handle disagreements? What happened when someone couldn't contribute? How did traditions adapt to changing circumstances? Josiah realized he was enjoying himself. The conversation flowed naturally, without the careful tiptoeing around his grief that characterized most of his interactions since Martha's death. Lucy and Carol weren't trying to cheer him up or distract him from his loss. They were simply interested in who he was and how he lived on as the evening wound down. Lucy made a request that surprised him. "Mr. Miller, would you teach me to make something from your wife's recipes? Maybe something simple?" Josiah looked at the child's eager face, then at Carol's encouraging smile. The idea of using Martha's recipes again, of sharing her knowledge with someone who would appreciate it, felt both daunting and appealing. "There's a recipe for friendship bread," he said slowly. "It takes several days, requires patience." Martha used to make it for new neighbors, or when someone in the community was going through difficult times. "I have patience," Lucy said solemnly, "and Mom says we have time." Carol nodded. "If you're willing to teach her, Mr. Miller, I think it would be a wonderful project for us to work on together." As Josiah walked home that evening, Martha's recipe box tucked under his arm, he found himself thinking about the concept of friendship bread. Martha had always said the best part wasn't the eating, but the making the way it brought people together in a common purpose. The conversations that happened while kneading dough, the satisfaction of creating something nourishing with your own hands. For the first time since her death, he could imagine her recipes being used again, not as monuments to her memory, but as living connections between past and present, between the wisdom she had accumulated and the curiosity of a child, eager to learn. The evening had been a small step, but it felt significant. He had shared a meal outside his own home, had talked about Martha without the crushing weight of grief, had committed to teaching someone else the skill she had valued. Most importantly, he had begun to see himself not just as a man defined by his loss, but as someone who still had knowledge worth sharing and connections worth making. Standing on his porch, looking across at the warm lights glowing in the Thompson house, Josiah felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: anticipation for tomorrow. Late that night, after the warmth of dinner with the Thompsons had settled into memory, Josiah sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper before him. The kerosene lamp cast a circle of yellow light that seemed to hold him in its embrace as he picked up his pen and began to write. "My dearest Martha, I don't know if what I'm doing is right or wrong, but I feel compelled to tell you about what happened today. I had dinner with our new neighbors, the English woman Carol and her daughter Lucy. You remember the child who saved my life. I brought your recipe box with me. I hope that was appropriate. They admired your handwriting, your careful instructions. Lucy wants to learn to make your friendship bread." I said yes, though I'm not sure I remember all the steps correctly without you there to guide me. I've been thinking about what you would say about all this. I think you would like Carol Thompson. She's practical and kind. Reminds me a little of your sister Ruth in the way she manages her household efficiently, but without fuss. And Lucy, oh Martha, she has such curious eyes. She asks questions the way our own children used to, before they learned that some subjects make adults uncomfortable. I miss you every day, but tonight the missing feels different somehow. Less like a wound that won't heal and more like, I don't know how to describe it. Like a conversation that was interrupted, but might someday continue. I hope I'm not betraying your memory by beginning to care about other people again. I hope you understand that learning to live without you doesn't mean forgetting you. Your devoted husband, Josiah. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others he had written over the past 3 years, letters he could never send but somehow needed to write. Writing to Martha had become his way of processing changes, of testing his thoughts against the imagined voice of the woman who had known him better than anyone else. The following afternoon, Lucy arrived at the fence line precisely when school ended. Her backpack dropped in her usual spot by the gate. She had been thinking about the friendship bread all day, had even taken notes during her math class about the timing involved, 7 days from start to finish, with specific tasks required on particular days. Are you ready to start? She called to Josiah, who was repairing a section of fence that didn't really need repairing, but gave him an excuse to work near the property line. Come over, he said, gesturing toward the gate he had left unlatched. We'll work in my kitchen today. Your mother is welcome to join us when she gets home from work. Lucy's excitement was infectious as she followed him into the farmhouse. She had never been inside an Amish home before, and her eyes took in everything: the simple furniture, the absence of electrical appliances, the way natural light filled the rooms through large windows. It's so quiet, she observed, not critically, but with wonder. You can actually hear the clock ticking. Josiah noticed the silence too, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel oppressive. With Lucy's presence filling the space, the house felt lived in rather than abandoned. In the kitchen, he retrieved Martha's recipe box and found the card for friendship bread. Martha's handwriting was as familiar to him as his own, her careful notes in the margins providing guidance he had forgotten he possessed. "First, we make the starter," he explained, reading from the card. "It's like planting a seed that will grow over several days." Lucy watched intently as he measured flour, sugar, milk, and yeast into a glass bowl. Her questions came steadily. Why glass instead of metal? How did the yeast know what to do? What would happen if they used too much or too little of each ingredient? Josiah found himself remembering things Martha had taught him, explanations she had given when he had asked similar questions as a young husband, learning to appreciate the science behind her cooking. Teaching Lucy became a way of honoring Martha's knowledge while discovering his own capacity to share it. When Carol arrived home an hour later, she found them sitting at the kitchen table, the starter mixture between them, Lucy taking careful notes in a composition book she had designated as her bread journal. "How did the first lesson go?" Carol asked, accepting Josiah's invitation to join them for coffee. "Mr. Miller knows so much," Lucy said, looking up from her notes. "Did you know that yeast is actually alive? It eats the sugar and makes bubbles. That will make the bread rise." Carol smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "I did know that, but I'm glad you're learning it properly. Mr. Miller, I hope she wasn't too full of questions." "Not at all," Josiah replied, and realized he meant it. Lucy's curiosity reminded him of the pleasure he had once taken in understanding how things worked, in mastering skills that connected him to generations of knowledge and tradition. Over the following days, the Friendship Bread Project became a bridge between their two households. Each morning, Lucy would stop by before school to stir the starter and add the day's ingredients. Each afternoon, she would return to check its progress and learn something new about the process. On the fourth day, as they prepared to divide the starter and begin new batches, Carol made an observation that surprised Josiah with its insight. "You know, Mr. Miller, this bread really is about friendship, isn't it? Not just because you share it with people, but because making it properly requires trust and patience and the willingness to tend something carefully over time." Josiah looked at her with new appreciation. She had understood something that Martha had tried to explain to him years ago, that the best recipes weren't just about food, but about the relationships and values that made sharing food meaningful. That evening, Aaron arrived for his usual check on his father's well-being and found him in the kitchen with Lucy, both of them covered in flour as they kneaded dough for the final stage of the bread-making process. "Dad," Aaron's voice carried a note of confusion, as if he had walked into the wrong house. "Aaron, come meet Lucy Thompson," Josiah said, not pausing in his work. "Lucy, this is my son, Aaron." Lucy looked up from her portion of dough and smiled politely. "Hello, Mr. Aaron. Your father is teaching me to make friendship bread. It's a lot more complicated than regular bread, but also more interesting." Aaron studied the scene, his grief-stricken father working happily beside an English child. Both of them engaged in an activity that filled the kitchen with warmth and purpose. It was so different from the mechanical routine that had characterized his father's life for the past 3 years that he struggled to process what he was seeing. "It's nice to meet you, Lucy," he managed. "I've heard about what you did for my father. Our whole family is grateful." "I just did what I learned in school," Lucy replied matter-of-factly. "But I'm glad I was there when he needed help." Later, after Lucy had gone home with a promise to return the next day for the final baking, Aaron lingered in his father's kitchen. "Dad, you seem different, better, more like yourself." Josiah considered his son's observation as he cleaned flour from the wooden countertops. "I feel more like myself. Or maybe I feel like someone I used to be before. He didn't finish the sentence, but Aaron understood. The Thompsons seem like good people. They are. Lucy is curious about everything, wants to understand how things work rather than just accepting that they do. It reminds me of teaching you children when you were small. Aaron nodded slowly. Just be careful, Dad. You're still recovering. Don't take on too much too quickly. After Aaron left, Josiah sat in his quiet kitchen and thought about his son's words. Was he taking on too much? The friendship with Lucy and Carol certainly required energy, attention, emotional investment that he had withheld for 3 years. But rather than depleting him, these new connections seemed to be restoring something he had thought permanently lost: his sense of purpose, his pleasure in sharing knowledge, his capacity for forming new bonds without betraying old ones. Tomorrow, they would bake the friendship bread. Lucy would take loaves home to her mother, and he would have something to share with his own children. The bread would be tangible proof that Martha's recipes could live on, not as museum pieces, but as active ingredients in new relationships and continuing traditions. For the first time since Martha's death, Josiah fell asleep, looking forward to tomorrow rather than simply enduring today. The birdhouse taking shape in Josiah's workshop was unlike any he had built before. Traditionally, his functional approach to woodworking had focused on durability and purpose rather than ornamentation. But this project seemed to call for something different. Lucy had mentioned that she loved watching the cardinals that visited her mother's feeder, and Josiah found himself crafting entrance holes sized specifically for cardinals, adding subtle decorative elements that would appeal to a child's sense of wonder without compromising the structure's utility. "It's beautiful," Lucy said, running her small fingers along the smooth edges he had sanded that afternoon. "The birds are going to love it." They were working together in the workshop after school, Lucy sitting on a low stool while Josiah demonstrated how to use sandpaper to achieve a finish that was both smooth and naturally textured. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities that Lucy seemed to possess in abundance. "Why do you make it so smooth?" she asked, concentrating on her portion of the project. "Wouldn't the birds be okay with it rough?" "They would," Josiah admitted. "But there's satisfaction in doing work well, even when no one will notice. My father taught me that how you do anything is how you do everything." Lucy considered this philosophy seriously. "So if I do careful work on the birdhouse, I'll probably do careful work on my homework too. Something like that?" "Yes." Their conversations during these afternoon sessions had begun to range far beyond woodworking techniques. Lucy was preparing for a school presentation about different cultures in their community, and she had asked Josiah if she could interview him about Amish traditions and beliefs. "I want to get it right," she had explained earnestly. "A lot of kids think Amish people are just like characters in movies, but I know it's more complicated than that." Her questions had pushed Josiah to articulate aspects of his faith and culture that he normally took for granted. Why did the community prioritize simplicity? How did they make decisions together? What was the purpose of traditions that might seem restrictive to outsiders? "We believe that having less allows you to appreciate more," he had explained. "When you're not distracted by constantly wanting new things, you can pay attention to what you already have: your family, your community, your relationship with God." "That makes sense," Lucy had replied. "My mom says the same thing about why we don't have a television. She says it's better to talk to each other." The similarities between Carol's intentional parenting choices and Amish community values had not escaped Josiah's notice. While the Thompsons lived very differently from his people in many ways, their commitment to purposeful living, to prioritizing relationships over material accumulation, created common ground that surprised him. 2 weeks later, Josiah found himself in an elementary school gymnasium, sitting on a folding chair that was slightly too small for his frame. watching Lucy present her project on Amish culture to her fifth-grade class. She had asked him to attend as a community expert, and despite his usual avoidance of public settings, he had been unable to refuse her earnest invitation. Lucy's presentation was thorough and respectful, covering everything from agricultural practices to religious beliefs. She had included photographs she had taken of his farm with permission, samples of Martha's handwriting from the recipe cards, and even a small piece of the friendship bread they had made together. "The most important thing I learned," Lucy concluded, "is that being Amish isn't about being old-fashioned or weird. It's about choosing what matters most and organizing your whole life around those choices." Mr. Miller and his community have decided that family, faith, and taking care of each other are more important than having the newest technology or the biggest house. During the question period that followed, Josiah found himself fielding inquiries from curious 10-year-olds with the same patience he had once shown his own grandchildren. Their questions were direct and sometimes amusing. Did he miss watching television? How did he keep food cold without a refrigerator? Was it hard to drive a horse instead of a car? But underneath their curiosity, he sensed genuine respect for choices that were different from their own. Lucy's presentation had clearly conveyed that Amish traditions were thoughtful responses to fundamental questions about how to live well, rather than arbitrary restrictions or primitive backwardness. "Mr. Miller," one boy asked near the end of the session, "do you ever wish you lived like us instead of how you do?" Josiah considered the question seriously. "I think every way of life has advantages and challenges. I've chosen the way that feels right for my beliefs and my community. But I've learned a lot from getting to know Lucy and her mother, who live very differently but share many of the same values." After the presentation, as Josiah walked with Lucy toward the school parking lot where Carol waited to drive him home, the child seemed both proud and thoughtful. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "Did I explain things right?" "You did wonderfully," Josiah assured her. "You understood things that many adults never grasp." "I want to keep learning," Lucy said. "There's so much more I want to know about farming and cooking and making things with your hands." That evening, over dinner in his own kitchen, a meal that Carol had brought over as thanks for his participation in Lucy's school event, Josiah found himself reflecting on how much his world had expanded in just a few weeks. "You've been very generous with your time and knowledge," Carol said as they shared the chicken and dumplings she had prepared. "Lucy has learned so much, but I think the experience has been valuable for her classmates too. Most of them have never had the chance to interact directly with someone from the Amish community. It's been good for me as well," Josiah admitted. "I'd forgotten the pleasure of teaching someone who really wants to learn." Lucy looked up from her careful work on the birdhouse, which they had brought to the kitchen table for final detail work. "Mr. Miller, would you come to my birthday party next month? It's not going to be anything fancy, just cake and games in our backyard. But I'd really like you to be there." The invitation was simple, innocent, the kind of request that would have seemed impossible for him to accept just a few months earlier. Birthday parties were for families, for close friends, for people who were woven into the fabric of daily life. But looking at Lucy's hopeful face, at Carol's encouraging smile, Josiah realized that perhaps he had become, unexpectedly, part of their fabric. "I would be honored to attend," he said, and watched Lucy's face light up with delight. Later that night, as he worked alone in his shop, putting finishing touches on the birdhouse that would be his gift to Lucy, Josiah thought about the changes that had transformed his life so gradually that he had barely noticed them happening. He was eating regular meals again, looking forward to specific events, investing emotional energy in relationships that brought him joy rather than obligation. The birdhouse in his hands was proof of this transformation. Every careful joint, every smooth surface, every thoughtful detail represented his growing capacity to create beautiful things for people he cared about. It wasn't just a functional object. It was a tangible expression of affection, hope, and the pleasure of giving something meaningful to someone who would treasure it. When he hung the finished birdhouse in Lucy's yard the following afternoon, watching her exclaim over its craftsmanship and immediate hurry to fill it with seeds, Josiah felt something he had not experienced since before Martha's illness. The deep satisfaction of work well done for love rather than duty. The joy of contributing to someone else's happiness without expecting anything in return. The birdhouse would weather many seasons, would provide shelter for generations of cardinals, would remind Lucy of their friendship long after she had grown up and moved away. But for now, it was simply a symbol of what had become possible when an old man allowed himself to care about new people, to invest in connections that honored the past while embracing an unexpected future. The medical test results arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a postal worker who had no way of knowing that the manila envelope he placed in Josiah's mailbox contained the power to reshape everything that had been rebuilt over the past 2 months. Josiah carried the envelope inside without opening it, setting it on the kitchen table while he finished his morning coffee and tried to prepare himself for whatever news Dr. Chun had deemed too sensitive for a phone call. Echocardiogram and stress test results painted a clear picture. His heart function had not improved as much as they had hoped. The damaged muscle tissue from his massive heart attack had healed with significant scarring, leaving him with what the medical terms called severely compromised cardiac function. Dr. Chun's accompanying letter was gentle but direct. He needed more aggressive intervention soon. The good news, Dr. Chen explained when Josiah called her office that afternoon, is that you're an excellent candidate for bypass surgery. The procedure can restore blood flow around the damaged areas and significantly improve your quality of life and long-term prognosis. And the bad news? Josiah asked, though he suspected he already knew. It's major surgery, Mr. Miller. There are always risks, especially given the extent of damage from your initial heart attack. The surgeon will want to see you next week to discuss the specifics, but I want you to know that waiting isn't really an option. Your current cardiac function is too compromised to sustain you long-term without intervention. After ending the call, Josiah sat in his kitchen and stared at the test results as if looking at them long enough might change their meaning. The medical terminology was largely incomprehensible to him, but the summary was clear enough. His heart was failing, and major surgery was his only chance for a meaningful future. For 3 years after Martha's death, he had moved through his days with little regard for the future, accepting the possibility of joining her as more comfort than threat. But now, with connections to Lucy and Carol woven into the fabric of his daily life, with renewed relationships with his own children, with projects unfinished and promises to keep, the prospect of major surgery filled him with complex emotions. He struggled to sort through. That afternoon, Lucy arrived at her usual time to find Josiah sitting on his front porch rather than working in the shop or barn. She approached the fence line with her customary enthusiasm, but stopped when she noticed his stillness. "Mr. Miller, are you feeling okay?" He looked at her earnest face, at the concern already forming in her young eyes, and felt the weight of what he needed to tell her. Over the past weeks, Lucy had begun to depend on their daily interactions, to plan her afternoons around their shared projects and conversations. How could he explain that their friendship might be interrupted by something as serious as life-threatening surgery? "I got some news today about my heart," he said carefully. "I'm going to need another operation, a bigger one this time." Lucy's face went very still, the way children's faces do when they're trying to process information that frightens them. "Are you going to be okay?" "I hope so," Josiah replied, offering the most honest answer he could manage. "But it's serious surgery, and I wanted you to know about it before I talk to your mother." "When?" "Probably in the next few weeks. The doctors say it can't wait much longer." Lucy climbed through the fence rails without asking permission and walked directly to his porch, settling herself on the steps near his chair. Her presence was both comforting and heartbreaking. A 10-year-old child shouldn't have to worry about adult medical crises, shouldn't have to face the possibility of losing someone she had grown to care about. "I'm scared," she said simply. "So am I," Josiah admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. When Carol arrived home an hour later, she found them sitting together in comfortable silence, Lucy leaning against Josiah's chair while he occasionally reached down to pat her shoulder. The scene was so natural, so clearly that of two people who had found comfort in each other's company, that Carol felt a pang of protective anxiety about what changes might be coming. "Lucy said you have some medical news?" Carol asked after Lucy had gone inside to start her homework. Josiah explained Dr. Chun's recommendations, the timeline for surgery, the risks and potential benefits. As he talked, he watched Carol's professional assessment take over, her nursing experience helping her understand the implications, even as her personal concern for his well-being made her ask the questions a friend would ask. "Dr. Chun is an excellent cardiologist," Carol said when he finished. "And the cardiac surgery team at Lancaster General has a very good reputation. But you're right, it's serious surgery." "I keep thinking about timing," Josiah said. 3 months ago, I would have said it was God's will if I didn't survive such an operation. Now you have reasons to want to recover," Carol finished. "That's not selfish, Mr. Miller. That's human." That evening, Josiah called each of his children to explain the situation. Their reactions were predictably intense. Ruth immediately began planning to take leave from her job to coordinate his care. Aaron started researching cardiac surgeons and hospital statistics, and Miriam offered to move into his house during his recovery period. Their concern was loving but overwhelming. Within hours of his phone calls, they had created a detailed care plan that would essentially require him to surrender all independence and decision-making authority to their collective judgment. Their intentions were good, but their approach felt suffocating. "We should probably discuss having the surgery done in Philadelphia," Aaron said during an evening gathering at Josiah's house. "The cardiac programs there are more advanced, have better outcomes for complex cases." "I want Dr. Chun to remain involved in my care," Josiah replied. "She knows my case, understands my situation. I trust her judgment." "But Dad," Ruth interjected, "this isn't about comfort or convenience. This is about giving you the best possible chance of survival." The conversation continued for over an hour, with his children debating treatment options, recovery locations, and care arrangements as if he weren't present. Their love was evident, but so was their assumption his age and recent medical crisis had compromised his ability to make important decisions about his own life. Finally, Josiah stood up from his own kitchen table and walked to the window, overlooking the Thompson property. Lights were on in their small house, and he could see Lucy at the kitchen table, probably working on homework while Carol prepared dinner. The normalcy of their evening routine, the quiet efficiency of their small family unit, stood in sharp contrast to the anxious planning session taking place in his own home. "I appreciate all your concern," he said without turning around, "but I need some time to think about these decisions myself. The surgery is necessary, I understand that. But how and where and what happens afterward, those are choices I need to make." His children exchanged glances loaded with 30 years of family dynamics. They loved him, wanted to protect him, but had also grown accustomed to making decisions about family matters collectively. His assertion of independence, his insistence on retaining control over his own medical care, represented a change in their understanding of his capabilities and his role in the family. "Of course, Dad," Miriam said gently. "We just want to help." "I know, and I'll need your help. But I also need to feel like this is still my life, my choice about how to live it," or he didn't finish the sentence, but but they all understood. After his children left, Josiah sat in his quiet kitchen and tried to sort through the complex emotions the day had brought. Fear, certainly fear of surgery, of complications, of the possibility that he might not survive to see how his friendships with Lucy and Carol continued to develop. But also something else, a fierce desire to live, to recover, to continue building the connections that had given his life new meaning. 3 years ago, facing such a diagnosis would have felt like a merciful release from the burden of living without Martha. Now, it felt like a threat to possibilities he was just beginning to explore, relationships he was just learning to value, a version of himself he was just beginning to rediscover. The medical test results lay on his table like a map to an uncertain future. But for the first time since Martha's death, Josiah Miller was determined to fight for that future, whatever it might hold. The family photograph had been hiding in Martha's recipe box for 3 years, tucked behind the divider marked Special Occasions. Josiah discovered it while looking for her recipe for molasses cookies, something he wanted to make with Lucy before his surgery. The picture showed all of them gathered around the kitchen table for Ruth's birthday celebration, taken just 6 months before Martha's diagnosis changed everything. In the photograph, Martha sat at the head of the table, her face glowing with the quiet satisfaction of a woman surrounded by the family she had helped create and nurture. Ruth and her husband flanked her on one side, their 4 children clustered nearby in various states of dessert-induced bliss. Aaron and his wife occupied the other side with their 3 boys, while Miriam and her daughters completed the circle. And there, at the foot of the table, sat Josiah himself, looking relaxed and genuinely happy in a way that seemed foreign to him now. The photograph was a revelation. For 3 years, he had remembered only Martha's illness, the months of treatments, and diminishing hope. The gradual withdrawal from normal life as cancer claimed more and more of her strength. But here was evidence of what had come before decades of birthday celebrations, family dinners, holiday gatherings, and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had created the foundation of love strong enough to sustain such devastating loss. We were happy, he said aloud to the empty kitchen, his voice carrying a note of wonder. We were really, truly happy. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the cardiac surgeon at Lancaster General, had scheduled his bypass surgery for the following Monday. The consultation had been thorough and sobering. 5 hours of surgery, a week in the hospital, 6 to 8 weeks of careful recovery. The risks were significant but manageable, the potential benefits substantial enough to justify the ordeal. The key to successful recovery, Dr. Reeves had explained, is having strong motivation and good support systems. Patients who have compelling reasons to get well, who have people counting on their recovery, tend to do much better than those who are simply going through the motions. Sitting in his kitchen with the rediscovered photograph, Josiah understood that he now had both motivation provided by his renewed connections with Lucy and Carol, and support systems that included not only his own family, but also the unexpected friendship that had grown up across the fence line between their properties. Over the past week, as word of his upcoming surgery spread through the Amish community, neighbors have begun stopping by with offers of help and expressions of concern. Bishop Samuel Yoder had visited to pray with him and discuss any spiritual preparation he might need. Martha's sister Rebecca had driven down from Reading to spend time, reminiscing about family gatherings and shared memories. The attention was both welcome and overwhelming. For 3 years, he had lived in virtual isolation, declining invitations, and avoiding community gatherings. Now, facing the possibility that he might not return from surgery, people were reaching out to reconnect, to offer support, to remind him that his life had mattered to more people than he had allowed himself to remember. Lucy had responded to news of his surgery with the practical determination that characterized her approach to most challenges. She had researched cardiac recovery on the computer at school, had asked her mother detailed questions about post-surgical care, and had begun making plans for how she could help during his convalescence. "I can read to you while you're getting better," she had announced. "And I can help with simple cooking if you teach me a few more recipes before the surgery. Mom says it's important for patients to eat nutritious food during recovery." A matter-of-fact approach to his medical crisis was both touching and somehow reassuring. While his own family tended toward anxious hovering and worst-case scenario planning, Lucy treated his surgery as a temporary obstacle to be managed rather than a catastrophic threat to their friendship. Carol had been equally practical, but more subtle in her support. She had quietly coordinated with Ruth to ensure that someone would be available to drive him to pre-surgical appointments, had researched the surgeon's credentials and success rates, and had offered to provide professional nursing consultation during his recovery period. "I've seen a lot of cardiac patients during my career," she had told him during one of their evening conversations. "The surgery Dr. Reeves is recommending has excellent outcomes when patients follow the recovery protocol carefully. You're going to do fine." Her confidence was based on professional experience, but Josiah sensed it was also grounded in personal investment. Over the months of their friendship, Carol had become genuinely attached to him, not just as Lucy's project or as an interesting neighbor, but as someone whose well-being mattered to her independent of any other considerations. The evening before his surgery, Josiah sat at his kitchen table writing letters he hoped he would never need to send. The first was to his children, thanking them for their love and forgiveness, acknowledging his failures as a father during the years of grief, and expressing his hopes for their continued happiness. The second was to Lucy, written in simpler language appropriate for a 10-year-old, telling her how much her friendship had meant to him and encouraging her to continue learning about the world with the same curiosity and courage she had shown in saving his life. The third letter was the most difficult to write. "Dear Carol, if you are reading this, it means the surgery did not go as we hoped. I want you to know that the past few months of friendship with you and Lucy have been the happiest I've experienced since Martha's death. You help me remember that life continues to offer opportunities for connection and joy, even after devastating loss. Please tell Lucy that the birdhouse we made together will always remind me of her kindness and curiosity. Please tell her that knowing her helped me become a better man, a better father, and a better neighbor. You have been a gift to an old man who thought his capacity for new friendships had died with his wife. Thank you for your patience, your kindness, and your willingness to let me be part of your small family's life. With deep gratitude and affection, Josiah." Writing the letters forced him to confront the real possibility that he might not survive the surgery, that Monday morning might be the last time he saw his children, that his friendship with Lucy and Carol might end just as it was beginning, to deepen into something truly meaningful. But the exercise also clarified what he was fighting for. The letters weren't expressions of defeat. They were affirmations of what made life worth preserving. His children had forgiven his withdrawal and were eager to rebuild their relationships with him. Lucy continued to see possibilities for learning and growth in every interaction they shared. Carol had shown him that friendship could develop even across significant differences in age, background, and life experience. Saturday evening brought an unexpected gathering. Ruth had organized what she carefully called a family dinner. But when Josiah arrived at her house, he found not only his own children and grandchildren, but also several neighbors. Bishop Yoder, Martha's sister Rebecca, and to his surprise, Carol and Lucy Thompson. "We wanted to give you a chance to see everyone before the surgery," Ruth explained, her voice carefully controlled to hide the emotion behind the gesture. The evening was unlike any social gathering Josiah had attended in years. Conversation flowed naturally between Amish and English guests. Children played together regardless of their different backgrounds, and the focus remained on shared affection for him, rather than on anxiety about the surgery to come. Lucy had brought the birdhouse they had worked on together, now painted with delicate details that showed her careful attention to his craftsmanship lessons. "I finished the decorations," she announced proudly, "and I hung it in our yard yesterday. The cardinals found it already." Bishop Yoder offered a prayer for the gathering, asking for guidance for the surgical team, strength for Josiah during his recovery, and comfort for all who loved him during the uncertainty to come. The prayer was simple, heartfelt, and somehow encompassed the entire extended community that had formed around Josiah's medical crisis. As the evening wound down, Josiah found himself standing in Ruth's garden with Carol, both of them watching Lucy chase fireflies with his grandchildren in the gathering dusk. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said. "I know this isn't your community, your tradition." "It is now," Carol replied simply. "Lucy and I have become part of this, haven't we? Part of caring about what happens to you, part of hoping and praying for your recovery." "Yes," Josiah agreed. "You have." Sunday passed in quiet preparation. Josiah attended church services where the entire congregation offered prayers for his surgery. He spent the afternoon in his workshop, organizing tools and completing small projects that had been waiting for attention. As evening approached, he walked through his house, touching objects that connected him to Martha's memory: her rocking chair, her sewing basket, the wedding ring quilt she had finished just before her diagnosis. But rather than feeling like a farewell tour, the ritual felt like a recommitment to the life they had built together and the life he was determined to continue building. Martha's presence in the house was no longer a weight that held him back. It was a foundation that supported his courage to move forward. Lucy appeared at his kitchen door just as he was finishing a simple supper. "Mom said I could come say good luck," she said, her usual confidence tinged with nervousness. They sat together on his front porch as darkness settled over the farm. The birdhouse in her yard was visible in the distance, a small symbol of their friendship silhouetted against the evening sky. "I'm scared for you," Lucy admitted. "But I'm also excited for you to get better so we can keep working on projects together." "I'm scared too," Josiah replied. "But I'm also excited about getting better. That's a new feeling for me." "Will you try extra hard to get well?" Lucy asked. "Because I still have lots of questions about farming and building things. And Mom says you're the best teacher I've ever had." "I'll try very hard," Josiah promised. "I have lots more I want to teach you." As Carol came to collect Lucy for the night, she paused beside Josiah's chair. "We'll be at the hospital tomorrow morning," she said. "Lucy wanted to be there when you wake up from surgery. You don't need to—" "Yes, we do," Carol interrupted gently. "We need to be there. Your family now, Mr. Miller. That's what family does." After they left, Josiah sat alone on his porch and listened to the familiar sounds of his farm settling into evening quiet. Tomorrow would bring surgery, uncertainty, the possibility of complications or unexpected outcomes. But tonight, surrounded by evidence of renewed connections and restored relationships, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before Martha's illness: genuine hope for the future, whatever it might hold. Lucy's handmade Get Well card was a masterpiece of 10-year-old artistry and devotion. She had spent hours creating it the night before Josiah's surgery, using every colored pencil in her set to draw a detailed picture of their two houses connected by a rainbow bridge. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "Dear Mr. Miller, I hope your heart gets all fixed up so we can keep being friends forever. Love, Lucy Thompson. P.S. I already have new questions for when you feel better." Carol held the card as they sat in the surgical waiting room at Lancaster General Hospital, arriving before dawn to be there when Josiah was admitted for his preoperative preparations. The waiting room was already busy with other families, their faces showing the particular mixture of hope and anxiety that characterizes people whose loved ones are undergoing major surgery. Ruth, Aaron, and Miriam had claimed a corner section of the room. Their efficiency and organization evident in the way they had distributed themselves to monitor the information desk, track timing, and coordinate with other family members who would arrive throughout the day. They had welcomed Carol and Lucy warmly, their previous reservations about the English neighbors completely dissolved by their obvious caring for Josiah's well-being. He looked good when they took him back, Ruth reported to the group, nervous but determined. The anesthesiologist said the preoperative tests all looked stable. Lucy sat beside Carol, her legs swinging from the chair that was too tall for her, the get-well card clutched in her hands like a talisman. She had insisted on coming despite the early hour and the likelihood of a very long day, declaring that Mr. Miller needed to know his friends were nearby while the doctors fixed his heart. "How long until we know something?" Lucy asked Aaron, who had appointed himself the family's liaison with the surgical team. "Dr. Reeves said the surgery would take about 5 hours," Aaron replied. "They'll call down periodically to let us know how things are progressing." The cardiac surgery unit at Lancaster General was a well-orchestrated environment, where time moved differently than in the outside world. Dr. Patricia Reeves and her surgical team had performed hundreds of bypass procedures, their movements precise and coordinated as they worked to restore blood flow around the damaged areas of Josiah's heart. In the operating room, Josiah's life was measured in heartbeats and blood pressure readings, in the steady rhythm of the heart-lung machine that was keeping him alive while his own heart was temporarily stopped for repair. The surgical team worked with quiet concentration, their conversation limited to essential communications about sutures, grafts, and the technical details of cardiac reconstruction. But in the waiting room, Josiah's life was measured in the stories his family and friends shared to pass the anxious hours. Ruth told Lucy about the dollhouse her father had built for her 40th birthday, complete with miniature furniture that demonstrated his attention to detail and his understanding of what would bring her joy. Aaron described learning carpentry from his father, the patience Josiah had shown in teaching him to measure twice and cut once, to respect both the tools and the materials they were using. Miriam shared memories of her mother and father working together in their garden, Martha planning the layout while Josiah prepared the soil, both of them finding deep satisfaction in the seasonal rhythms of planting, tending, and harvesting. They were true partners, she said. Each one made the other stronger. Carol listened to these family stories with the respectful attention of someone privileged to witness intimate memories. She contributed her own observations about Josiah's teaching methods, his patience with Lucy's endless questions, his obvious pleasure in sharing knowledge with someone eager to learn. "He's been a wonderful mentor to Lucy," Carol said. "But I think she's been good for him too. She sees him as a source of wisdom and skill, not as someone to worry about or take care of." Lucy nodded earnestly. "Mr. Miller knows how to do everything, and he always explains why things work the way they do, not just how to do them." 2 hours into the surgery, a surgical nurse appeared in the waiting room to provide the first update. "Dr. Reeves asked me to let you know that everything is proceeding normally," she reported. "They've successfully completed the initial phase of the procedure and are now working on the bypass grafts." The news was reassuring without being complete. Enough information to confirm that the surgery was progressing, but not enough to allow anyone to relax completely. The waiting continued, punctuated by periodic updates that used medical terminology to describe the incremental progress being made in the operating room. Lucy had brought a book to read, but found herself too distracted to focus on the story. Instead, she worked on a new drawing, this one showing Mr. Miller in his workshop, teaching her how to sand wood, both of them smiling as they worked on the birdhouse project that had become such an important symbol of their friendship. "What will you work on with Mr. Miller when he gets better?" Miriam asked, looking at Lucy's drawing. He promised to teach me how to make a real piece of furniture. Lucy replied, maybe a step stool for my bedroom or a small bookshelf. Something that requires joints and measurements and planning. The idea that Josiah was making plans for future projects, that he was looking beyond his surgery toward continued collaboration with Lucy, comforted everyone in the waiting room. It suggested that he was fighting not just to survive, but to return to the relationships and activities that had given his life new meaning. Bishop Yoder arrived mid-morning with several other members of the Amish community, their presence a quiet reminder of the extended network of people who cared about Josiah's recovery. They didn't speak much, but their willingness to spend the day in the unfamiliar environment of a modern hospital demonstrated the depth of their concern and their commitment to supporting the Miller family during this crisis. As the morning stretched toward afternoon, Carol found herself thinking about the unexpected way her own life had been enriched by her friendship with Josiah. She had moved to Lancaster County seeking a quieter, safer environment for Lucy, hoping to find a sense of community that had been missing from their suburban life. But she hadn't expected to find a mentor for her daughter or a friend for herself, who would challenge her assumptions about age, culture, and the possibilities for meaningful connection across difference. Mrs. Thompson? Lucy's voice was small, uncertain. What if something goes wrong? What if Mr. Miller doesn't wake up? Carol put her arm around her daughter, feeling the weight of a question she had been avoiding all morning. Then we'll remember how lucky we were to know him, she said carefully. And we'll take care of the things he cared about: his farm, his family, the friendships he made with us. But I want him to wake up, Lucy said, her voice thick with emotion. I want him to see the Cardinal family that's living in our birdhouse. I want to keep learning from him. I want that too, sweetheart. We all do. The 4th hour of surgery brought another update, this one more detailed and encouraging. Dr. Reeves wants you to know that they've successfully completed all the bypass grafts, the nurse reported. They're now working on closing and ensuring that everything is functioning properly. She expects to be finished within the next hour. The relief in the waiting room was palpable but cautious. Everyone understood that the surgery's completion would mark the beginning of recovery rather than its end, that the next few days would be critical in determining how well Josiah's heart responded to the intervention. Lucy stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the hospital's courtyard, her get-well card still clutched in her hand. I can see the parking lot where we first came when Mr. Miller had his heart attack, she observed. It feels like that was a long time ago, but it was only a few months. A lot has changed in those few months, Ruth agreed. For all of us. As they waited for the final update that would tell them Josiah had survived the surgery, the small community gathered in the waiting room seemed to understand that they were all different people than they had been when the day began. The crisis had deepened existing relationships and created new bonds, and forced everyone to confront what mattered most and what they were willing to risk to preserve it. The surgery was ending, but in many ways, the most important part of Josiah's journey was just beginning. The completed birdhouse sat on the windowsill of Josiah's recovery room like a beacon of hope and continuity. Carol had brought it from Lucy's yard that morning, thinking he might like to see it when he woke from surgery. The craftsmanship was evident even in the sterile hospital environment, the careful joints, the smooth finish, the entrance hole sized perfectly for cardinals. But more important was what it represented, the future projects and conversations that waited for his recovery. Dr. Reeves appeared in the recovery room doorway at 3:47 p.m., still wearing her surgical scrubs but with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed a complex and critical procedure. The waiting room full of family and friends rose collectively as she approached, their faces reflecting the anxiety and hope that had sustained them through 5 hours of uncertainty. The surgery went very well, Dr. Reeves announced, her words causing an immediate release of tension throughout the group. We were able to complete 5 bypass grafts, which should restore excellent blood flow to all the affected areas of his heart. His vital signs are stable, and he's beginning to wake up from anesthesia." Lucy pressed against her mother's side. The get well card crumpled from hours of nervous handling. "Can we see him? Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to need time to recover, and the next few days will be important for monitoring how his heart responds to the surgery," Dr. Reeves explained. "But yes, I expect him to make a full recovery. He can have visitors, but just family members initially, and only 1 or 2 at a time." Ruth and Aaron exchanged a glance that encompassed 30 years of sibling communication before Ruth spoke. "Dr. Reeves, I'd like Carol and Lucy Thompson to be considered family for visiting purposes. They've become very important to our father." The surgeon nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen many non-traditional family configurations in her years of practice. "Of course. Just remember that he'll be tired and possibly disoriented as the anesthesia wears off." The cardiac recovery unit was a quieter environment than the surgical waiting room, designed to support healing rather than anxious anticipation. Josiah lay connected to monitors that tracked his heart rhythm, blood pressure, and oxygen levels, their electronic beeping providing constant reassurance that his newly repaired heart was functioning properly. His eyes were closed when Carol and Lucy entered the room, but they could see the steady rise and fall of his chest, the healthy color returning to his face, the peaceful expression of someone whose body was finally getting the oxygen-rich blood it needed to heal and thrive. "Mr. Miller?" Lucy whispered, approaching his bedside with the careful reverence of someone entering sacred space. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually finding her face. A smile spread slowly across his features as recognition dawned, the kind of genuine joy that comes from seeing beloved people after wondering if you ever would again. "Lucy," he managed, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube, but unmistakably warm. "You came." "I told you I would," Lucy replied, holding up her get-well card. "I made this for you. And Mom brought the birdhouse so you could see it." Josiah's gaze moved to the windowsill where their collaborative creation caught the afternoon light. Even in his post-surgical haze, he could appreciate the symbolism something they had built together, something that would continue to serve its purpose long after the immediate crisis had passed. "Beautiful work," he whispered. "Both of you." Over. The next hour, family members rotated through brief visits, each offering words of relief and encouragement, each reassured by his alertness and obvious determination to recover fully. Ruth brought news from the farm neighbors were helping with evening chores. The animals were fine. Everything would be waiting for his return. Aaron showed him get-well cards from community members, evidence of how many people had been praying for his successful surgery. Miriam simply held his hand and cried quietly, relieved beyond words that her father had survived the ordeal. But it was Lucy's visit that seemed to energize him most completely. She had brought not only her card and excited updates about the Cardinal family using their birdhouse, but also a list of new questions that had occurred to her during the long day of waiting. "I was wondering about winter on the farm," she said, settling carefully into the chair beside his bed. "Do the animals need different care when it gets cold? Do you make different things in your workshop? Is it harder or easier to work when everything is quiet because of snow?" Her questions pulled him back into the role of teacher and mentor, reminded him that his knowledge and experience had value beyond his own immediate survival. As he began to answer her inquiries, his voice grew stronger and his thinking clearer, as if the act of sharing information about subjects he loved was itself a form of healing. "Winter is the best time for detailed woodworking," he explained. "The cold air keeps the workshop comfortable, even when you're working hard. And the shorter days mean more time indoors for projects that require concentration. Will you teach me some winter projects when you're feeling better?" Lucy asked. Mom says recovery takes a long time, but maybe we could work on simple things while you're getting stronger. I would like that very much, Josiah replied, and the promise felt like a commitment to the future rather than merely polite conversation. As evening approached and visiting hours came to an end, the small community that had gathered around Josiah's surgery began to disperse with the understanding that the crisis had passed, but the work of recovery was just beginning. His children would coordinate care and support during his hospital stay and initial weeks at home. Carol would provide professional nursing consultation when needed. Lucy would continue to ask questions and provide the kind of enthusiastic companionship that makes healing feel worthwhile. But the day had accomplished more than successful surgery. It had demonstrated the strength of the relationships that had formed around Josiah's friendship with Lucy and Carol, had shown his own family how much richer their father's life had become through these unexpected connections, and had proven to everyone involved that love and concern could bridge differences of age, culture, and background when people were willing to open their hearts to new possibilities. As Lucy prepared to leave, she placed her crumpled get-well card on Josiah's bedside table where he could see it easily. "I'll come back tomorrow after school," she promised, "and I'll bring new drawings of the Cardinals." "I'll be here," Josiah replied, and for the first time in 3 years, being somewhere felt like a gift rather than simply an obligation. 6 months later, the new family portrait captured a moment that would have been impossible to imagine when Josiah Miller first collapsed in his barn. The photograph showed Lucy's 11th birthday celebration in full swing, with guests scattered across the Thompson backyard in a scene that perfectly illustrated how completely the boundaries between their two households had dissolved. At the center of the picture, Lucy sat at a picnic table with her birthday cake, her face glowing with happiness as she prepared to blow out the candles. To her right, Josiah leaned forward with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take such moments for granted. His recovery from surgery had been complete and remarkable. Dr. Reeves had declared him one of her most successful patients, with cardiac function better than it had been in years. Surrounding them in the photograph were representatives of the extended community that had formed around their friendship. Ruth, Aaron, and Miriam stood with their families, their children playing in the background with the easy familiarity of cousins who saw each other regularly. Carol smiled from behind the camera's timer, having set up the group shot before rushing to join it herself. Even Bishop Yoder appeared in the frame, having stopped by to deliver a birthday gift made by one of the community's craftswomen. The birdhouse that had started as a simple woodworking project now sat prominently on a post in the garden, surrounded by flowers that Lucy had planted with guidance from both her mother and her Amish neighbor. A family of cardinals had indeed taken up residence, their bright red feathers providing flashes of color that caught everyone's attention during outdoor gatherings. But the most significant change captured in the photograph was in Josiah himself, the man who had spent 3 years moving through his days. Like someone serving a sentence, now radiated the quiet contentment of someone whose life had found new purpose and meaning. His relationship with Lucy had evolved into a genuine mentorship, with regular lessons in traditional skills, balanced by her instruction in modern subjects that expanded his own understanding of the world. Their latest project was a hope chest for Lucy's bedroom, a complex piece of furniture that required planning, precision, and patience. Working together in his shop 3 afternoons a week, they had spent months selecting wood, designing joints, and executing each step with the kind of careful attention to detail that created heirloom pieces rather than simply functional furniture. The secret, Josiah had explained to Lucy as they worked on the intricate dovetail joints that would connect the chest's corners, is understanding that good work takes time. Each cut, each measurement, each decision about grain direction, they all mattered to the final result. Lucy had proven to be an apt student, her natural curiosity enhanced by genuine respect for the skills he was teaching her. But more than that, she had become a bridge between his world and broader possibilities, introducing him to perspectives and experiences that enriched his understanding without threatening his core values. Through Lucy's school projects, Josiah had found himself serving as a cultural consultant for other students interested in learning about Amish traditions. Through her mother's nursing career, he had gained insight into medical practices that helped him manage his recovery more effectively. Through their friendship, he had rediscovered his capacity for joy, for anticipation, for investment in relationships. That extended beyond family obligation. The changes in his relationship with his own children had been equally profound. Ruth's weekly visits had evolved from anxious check-ins to genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Aaron had begun bringing his sons to work alongside their grandfather on farm projects, passing traditional skills to another generation while creating new memories. Miriam had started hosting monthly family dinners that included the Thompsons as a matter of course, her children delighting in the cultural exchange that occurred when Amish and English families shared meals and conversation. "You know what I realized?" Ruth had said to Carol during one of these gatherings. "I spent so much time worrying about Dad being alone that I forgot to appreciate how much he had to offer when he was ready to share it again." The community had noticed the transformation as well. Josiah's workshop had become a destination for neighbors seeking repairs, advice, or simply the pleasure of watching a master craftsman at work. His knowledge of traditional farming methods had proven valuable to younger families interested in sustainable agriculture. His quiet wisdom, seasoned by grief, but not defined by it, made him someone people sought out for counsel and perspective. But perhaps the most important change was the one that couldn't be captured in any photograph: the restoration of his sense of future. For 3 years after Martha's death, Josiah had lived in the past, preserving memories but avoiding new experiences. Now, at 68, he found himself making plans for next year's garden, for Lucy's graduation from high school, for projects that would take months or years to complete. The family portrait would join others in frames throughout both houses, evidence of a friendship that had begun with a child's courage during a medical emergency and had grown into something that enriched multiple generations and bridged different ways of life. As the birthday celebration continued into the evening, Josiah sat on the Thompsons' back porch with Carol, both of them watching Lucy demonstrate the woodworking techniques she had learned to her friends from school. "She's become quite the teacher herself," Carol observed. "I think she gets that from you." "She gets it from her own curiosity," Josiah replied. "I just provide some answers to keep the questions coming." "You've provided much more than that," Carol said softly. "You've given her a sense of connection to traditions and skills that most children her age never experience. But more than that, you've shown her what it looks like to find new purpose after loss, to remain open to friendship and growth even when life has been difficult." Josiah considered her words as he watched Lucy patiently explain the importance of working with wood grain rather than against it, her small hands demonstrating techniques he had taught her with the same care he had learned from his own father decades earlier. "Martha always said that the best gift you can give someone is your attention," he said. "Not advice, not solutions, just the willingness to pay attention to who they are and what they need." She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. And I think she would have loved Lucy very much. As the evening wound down and guests began to gather their things, Josiah felt the same sense of completion he experienced when finishing a particularly challenging piece of furniture. All the elements had come together: family, friendship, tradition, and innovation balanced in proportions that created something both beautiful and functional. The birdhouse in Lucy's yard caught the last rays of sunlight. Its occupants settled for the night in the shelter that had been created through patient collaboration between an aging, craftsman, and an eager child. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new questions, new opportunities to share knowledge and create connections that honored the past while embracing the future. But tonight, as Josiah walked home across the pasture that no longer separated his life from the Thompson family's, but connected them in an ongoing story of unexpected friendship, he carried with him the deep satisfaction of someone whose life had been saved not just by medical intervention, but by the willingness to remain open to love in all its surprising forms. Martha's wedding ring still rested on his finger, but it no longer felt like a weight holding him to the past. It had become a foundation supporting his capacity to build new relationships without betraying old ones, to honor memory while creating fresh experiences, to live fully in the present while carrying the best of what had come before into whatever came next. The photograph would fade with time. The birthday celebration would become just one of many happy memories. But the transformation it captured would continue to ripple outward through families, through communities, through the quiet, daily choices that determine whether we face the future with fear or with hope, with isolation or with the courage to remain open to unexpected grace.